All right, now we got the recording going. Okay, so the first term we looked at in this unit on perception was called figure ground. And this is a very simple concept, but can be very difficult. Actually, in order to perceive anything, it has to stand out and be different from the background. Okay, so that's figure ground. So if you look at the objects over here on the right, if you are looking at the white figures as the figure and black as the background, you would be looking at fish. But if you are looking at the black figures and the white is the background, then you'll be looking at birds. So, for example, if I were to take one of my students in class and paint them the same color as the wall in the back, you wouldn't be able to see them because they don't stand out from the background. So that is figure ground. All right, the next concept that we looked at, this is called Gestalt. So anytime that we sense something and perceive it, we take in the big picture first, and that's a defense mechanism that we have. It alerts us to danger, basically. So, for example, in this picture on the right, when you first see that, you'll see a forest scene, you'll see a man and two horses. That jumps out first. But then if you keep looking at it, your mind then breaks down details. That comes later. And this is Gestalt. Anytime you see the word whole, meaningful whole, that's your key. You're going to connect that to Gestalt, and that's a common question on the AP test. So you take in the big picture first, and then you break down details. In the picture on the left, you're going to notice, or what's going to stand out is this is a man who's facing in this direction. That appears to be his hand on his chest. But if you look a little bit closer, you'll see something different. You'll see a man with a hat right here and a woman with a long dress right here. And that appears to be a dog line in the street. But you don't notice that, you don't perceive that until you keep looking at it. Another example, when I ask students, or you ask you, read this saying that I have on the screen, most students will read it and say, Paris in the spring, because you're taking in the whole, and that makes sense. But if you look closer, it's actually Paris in the spring. But our minds kind of skip over that because it doesn't make sense. So you have to look at it for a little bit longer before you break down the details. All right, we looked at some Gestalt grouping principles. These are just like patterns that we tend to group things when we perceive them. So, for example, the first is proximity. So we tend to group things that are close together as being related or together. So the image up here on the right with the lines, that shows proximity. Instead of saying there's 6 individual lines, most people would perceive that as 3 parallel lines because of their proximity. Similarity. That's the picture here. To give you an example, we tend to group things that are similar. So instead of, when you look at this pattern of faces, we tend to group the pink together and the blue together because they're most similar. Continuity, whenever we see things cross, such as this, we tend to perceive them as ongoing or continuous. And closure, sometimes our mind just fills in gaps. Instead of actually, seeing a triangle here between the broken circles, there's nothing written, there's nothing drawn there, but our mind just closes in those gaps, fills in those gaps, and we perceive a triangle there. So that's an example of closure. All right, in this unit, we looked at depth perception. So that's the ability to judge depth or distance, understanding if you have enough room to pull into a parking spot and being able to shoot a free throw, things like that. Now, in this particular unit, they were concerned about depth perception in children and when that developed. So Gibson and Walk were 2 researchers who were at the Grand Canyon with their young son who was just getting ready to crawl. And if you've ever been to the Grand Canyon, there's no railing, and it's very high, and it's kind of frightening. So we know that animals have depth perception when they can move about, but they were curious, would children just crawl off of a cliff once they start moving, or do they recognize that that's a depth, that's distance? So they created their own test, because obviously they're not going to let their child wandering around at the rim of the Grand Canyon. They created what was called a visual cliff. So if you look at this diagram here, this is a glass table on top. Underneath, they have like a half table that's checkered, and they place the child over there on that checkered spot. Now, again, there's glass over here, so the child is safe. But when the child is placed here, they're coaxed across the glass by their mother or familiar face. And they're wondering if the child will cross that glass. They do not have depth perception because the table looks like it dips off. And what they found is most children, when they can crawl, would not cross the table. Some did, but most of them did not cross. So the thought is either when they start crawling or shortly after, children do develop depth perception. And that is shown through the visual cliff. All right, looking at a few distance or depth cues. First of all, binocular cues, which bi is meaning two, ocular for eyes. So you need two eyes to see these cues. First of all, the retinal disparity. There's a gap in our vision that is apparent about 12 inches from your face. So if you take both of your fingers like this, right in front of your eyes, about 12 inches away, and you look just slightly over the gap, you'll see a little floating finger like you see here. And that's the gap, the disparity in our vision. And it's because our eyes are at slightly different angles. So both of them are taking in information at different angles and then blending them together in your brain. And that's how you see 3D. So for like a 3D movie, you have two different cameras at the same angle that your eyes are at. And when they show the movie, you put on the glasses, and the glasses make the transformation that your brain normally does. All right, so convergence. As objects approach, our eyes move inward. So if you watch my eyes here, as my finger approaches, my eyes move inward. And that's a distance cue that kind of tells your brain, hey, things are getting close. Make sure you move back. All right, so those are two binocular cues that allow us to judge depth and distance. Now, we can still see depth and distance with one eye, and artists capture that very well. So these are called monocular cues. Mono mean for one, ocular for eyes. All right, so first of all, a linear perspective. Here you're looking at lines, parallel lines here. Now that'd be like a railroad tracks. If you stand there and you look off in the distance, it almost looks like they're going to actually cross, okay, because they get smaller too. So that's one way an artist can capture distance. Another thing is to make objects small. In real life, smaller objects are farther away. So if you create that on a painting, these trees back here look farther away than this one. In reality, they're both the same distance from you, but they look further away because they're smaller on the paper. And that's relative size. Another example, this truck looks further away. It's just as close as this one, but because in real life, smaller things are further away. All right, interposition. So in real life, you know, if something is closer to or in front of something else, it's closer to you. So again, an artist can capture this, or you can see this on a picture. The blue circle looks closer because it appears to be in front of the red circle. And this king appears to be closer than the king of spades. The king of clubs looks closer because it looks like it's in front of it. So that is interposition, another monocular cue for distance. All right, relative shadow, or sometimes called clarity. Things that are closer are more clear. Things that are farther away seem shadowed or hazy. So like in this picture, obviously the mountain looks closer to you than the hazy part. That seems to be further away. Of course, right now, they're the same distance from you, but you can capture that. Relative motion, when things are moving, the closer they are to you, the faster they appear to be moving. So a good example would be if you're coming in for a landing on an airplane, you're very far away from what's below. So when you come in and you're looking at traffic, it just looks like it's creeping along, because the farther something is away from you, the slower it appears to be moving. All right, another concept, the phi phenomenon. So the phi phenomenon is an illusion that we experience when lights that are right beside each other are moving. And I know in Schoology it doesn't show this, but when these blink on and off, it appears that they're going in a circular pattern. If you think of a marquee, a marquee sign, they have that arrow and the adjacent lights blink on and off. It looks like it is moving. So that is the phi phenomenon. Blinking lights that are adjacent to each other will reflect motion. All right, perceptual constancy. This is a very common AP question. There are 3 different types: color constancy or brightness constancy, shape constancy, and size constancy. So perceptual constancy would mean that whenever you perceive something and the image cast onto your retina changes, we still perceive it remaining constant or unchanging. And you know me, I don't like definitions. I think that's difficult to understand. So let's look at some examples. First of all, size. So if you look at a door that's closed like this one, it's a rectangle. But as it opens like this, the image that's cast onto your retina actually changes. But you don't look at it and say, oh, now it's a trapezoid. You still perceive it remaining a rectangle as unchanging. So, sorry, that's shape constancy. Color or brightness. When you're in a dimly lit area, only your rods are active. Your cones are not. Cones are only active in bright areas. So your cones allow you to see color. So if you're in a dark area, you cannot perceive color. But here's what's interesting. If you are, out at night and you walk by a brick building and it's pretty dark and you look at it, in reality, you would see it as a shade of gray, but we still in our minds perceive it as red, as unchanging, because we know that brick buildings are red. So that is color or brightness constancy. Size, I just mentioned that the further something gets away from you, the smaller it becomes. So if I have a student standing right here in front of me, and then I look over at McDonald's and I see other students, I still perceive them as being the same size, as people size. I don't look over and say, oh, look, now they've shrunk. So that is size constancy. Even though they get further away and they look small to our retina, we still perceive them as people size. So those are 3 types of perceptual constancy. And normally one of those will show up on the AP exam. All right, so we looked at sensation and perception. I'm going to go over this one more time. So sensation is everything that comes in through your senses. So everything you see, hear, taste, touch, and then smell. All right, so those impulses go to your brain and you interpret it. Sensation is bottom up, going from your senses up to your brain. Perception is after you interpret it, the impulses come back out, and sometimes we react to them. So top down. All right, so everyone can experience the same sensation, but we all perceive things very differently. You may listen to a song and you love it, and somebody else listens to the same song, so they have the same sensation, but they don't like it. I told you that I grew up, my parents took me to Broadway all the time. I love musicals. When I got married, I bought tickets for my husband and I to go see Les Mis. He had never been to the theater before. I thought he would love it because I do. And we got there and he fell asleep and he didn't really care for it. So we both experienced the same thing. We interpret it very different. And the reason that is because we all come from different backgrounds. Okay, we all have different experiences and expectations, which influence our perception. And this is referred to as the perceptual set. So this is your backgrounds, your expectations, your assumptions that influence how you perceive an event. So if I show you this picture here on the right, most of you have a background or have seen that before. And you would say, well, that's supposed to be the Loch Ness Monster. If I show you this one, most of you have seen that picture before, heard about it. That's supposed to be Bigfoot. But I've had foreign exchange students here that have never seen that before. So they have no background, they have no perceptual set. So they give me answers like a log in the water, or a gorilla, or a man in a suit, gorilla suit. So they don't have any background or perceptual set, so they can't figure out what it is. So I get a different answer. Here's another example. Most of you can tell me who this pixelated person is. You all recognize that as Abraham Lincoln because we've seen his picture so much. You have that perceptual set. Again, someone who's never seen that before or seen Abraham Lincoln's picture, they're not going to have any background. They won't have any clue who that might be. All right, whenever you are perceiving something, the context matters. The context is very important. So I showed you this example of this is Sun Mingming, who's 7'9", and Randy Gill, who's 6'2". I need to update the picture. They're old players. But in this picture, Randy Gill, who's 6'2", looks small. He looks short because of the context he's in. He's beside someone who's really, really tall. Okay, so if he's standing beside me, and he's 6'2" and I'm 5'4", then he'll look tall. So the context that something is perceived in makes a big difference. And I like to show this, but it won't let me in Schoology. But under this circle, it would have an A. And under this circle, you would see a C. So if I say, what do you see in the middle? You're going to say a B. But then when I get rid of those, and up here, there's a 12. And down here, there's a 14. Now I say, what do you perceive in the middle? And since the context changed and now it's numbers, people say 13. So context will influence how we perceive something. All right, perceptual adaptation. This is just looking at your sensation of vision. So whenever we have a distorted visual field, we're still able to adapt over time. And it doesn't really take long. And an example would be someone with cataracts. They have spots on their eyes. And at first, it interferes with their ability to accurately judge depth or distance. But over time, the brain, through plasticity, just adapts to that. So another example, this is Stratton. He created these goggles that invert our vision. So if you put them on, everything that you look at will be upside down. And you would think, well, there's no way you could adapt to that. But people within several days are able to adapt. They can write, they can ride bikes with everything completely upside down. I can't even imagine. So that is, plasticity, the amazing concept of plasticity in our brains, being able to adapt to that extreme change. All right, so that's everything perception. I'm going to pull up ESP now. So this is extrasensory perception. So having some perception without any sensory input. All right, this is the branch of psychology called parapsychology, studying paranormal occurrences. So people who work in this field, they are called parapsychologists. All right, we have two types of parapsychology or paranormal activity. All right, so the first one, psychokinesis. So this is mind over matter. So being able to control things with your thoughts. So if you saw the movie Carrie, she has the power of psychokinesis. So she looks at a door and it will slam, or she looks at something and it bursts into flames. So nobody's ever been able to prove they have this ability, surprisingly. But the second type of paranormal activity is extrasensory perception, ESP. So this is that perception without any sensory input. So we looked at 4 different types of ESP. The first one, telepathy. This is being able to read others' minds. They call these gifts, but I wouldn't say that's a gift. I wouldn't want to know what people were actually thinking about me at all times, because we're very judgmental and very critical of each other. So I wouldn't think that'd be a good thing. But in order to test that, they would have someone go in a room and other people in a different room. And those who claim that they can read someone's mind, they would say, okay, what are the people thinking in the other room? And nobody's ever been able to prove that. Clairvoyance, this is perceiving something is happening right now, off in a remote location. So maybe having an intuition that somebody you know has been in an accident. It's happened right now, far away. So that is the power of clairvoyance. A lot of people who claim to have the ability of clairvoyance will try to assist with law enforcement when someone is like kidnapped or gone missing, asking for items, personal items of the individual to try and get a sense of where they may be. A mediumship is somebody who can channel dead spirits. So they claim that they can talk to people who are deceased. So they held seances. Many people go to see a mediumship because they're desperate. They would really like to communicate with their loved one, really sad that their loved one has passed away. But normally a medium will say very vague statements that would be true about the person, things that have occurred to many of us, and very guided, like, they are telling me about a relationship they had, very vague things like that could apply to anyone in many circumstances. And then the person kind of runs with and says, oh, I know what they're talking about. They usually don't give specific, things about the person they're claimed to be talking to. Precognition. This is the ability to predict future events. So this would be like a prophecy. Another example would be like Nostradamus, who wrote a lot of things that he believed were going to happen in the future. Again, very, very vague predictions that you can look at what he wrote and connect it to multiple events. So not really specific. So I did give you a good example, though, of a British man, Chris Robinson, who they call the dream detective. He actually has dreams that predict things that are upcoming. And when he started having these dreams, it was usually like tragic things. And then he'd turn on the news and he would see, oh my goodness, this is, occurring. And I dreamt about it. This happened and I dreamt about it. So whenever he would dream things like that, after he realized what was going on with him, he would go to the police department and say, this is something that I dreamt about. And of course, at first they're thinking, yeah, right, this guy's off his rocker. But after so many credible instances, they started listening to him. So he started working with British intelligence. He came over here to Arizona State, which is a big paranormal university. They have a big unit for paranormal activity. And they did some studies with him where when he would sleep, he would get up and he would write down the things that he dreamt about. In 1 month earlier, prior to the attacks on 9/11, he got up and he said, I don't even want to talk about what I dreamt last night. I dreamt that the planes flew into the Twin Towers, were hijacked by terrorists. In his dream, he's actually on one of the planes. But the bad thing is he never knows when those events are going to occur. So he is pretty credible. He's predicting these things, but he just doesn't know when. So, all right, so that's everything with ESP. I figured it would take about a half hour, but I finished up just a little bit early. So I always recommend after you watch the video or you've been here with me that you try the practice questions in the practice book, that AP practice book that I gave you. Just kind of helps after it's fresh in your mind. So, all right. So you guys have a good night, and I will talk to you all tomorrow.
You are currently the only person in this conference.